Hello everyone, today we talk about late antique and early medieval Gaul, so roughly Gallic history between the 5th and the 6th century. I want to make this video because in recent times I finally arrived to talk about Gallic history a little bit, always usually in late Roman times and the early medieval period, usually the migration era. I made just recently a video about the creation of the Merovingian kingdom or empire, as you wanna object. I prefer empire usually, but because that's what it was. But still, the important is to understand obviously the birth of the kingdom first, and on the Burgundians. So I came to talk about Gallic society, or better Gallo-Roman society by that point, kind of hinting at certain characteristics that made this region of continental Europe to be objectively very important, especially at the time. Even in in the videos about the Christianization of the Roman Empire, often talked about Gaul in especially for its cultural importance at the time and in the process. So I felt I had never given I had to give a broader picture and a more thorough one of what of Gallo-Roman society, essentially, because that's what actually makes it, together with obviously the new Germanic rulers and this very fascinating multi-ethnical character of Gaul that is what also characterizes France today, and its peculiar culture, indeed. And so right now I have a lot of things I would like to say, but let's proceed orderly. So I think the key, first of all, one point that I think is very important: the late antique world was, generally speaking, a much more dynamic one than we often think. I'm sure many people have this idea that okay, the Roman Empire was declining, and for some, even the Eastern Roman Empire doesn't count as a Roman Empire, and therefore, it's the end of the Western half. It's a tragedy. Actually, it wasn't really so at all, and that's what I've been trying to explain throughout all my late antique history video, and this is especially truer in this phase of the 5th and also partly of the 6th century that definitely were a moment of decline. Complexively, I mean, there was definitely in terms of sheer, I mean, the economical crisis of the empire had kicked in even much earlier, indeed. But what I would like to say with this is that there were still a lot of resources, of cynetic energy that was out there, and especially Gaul was an amazingly big pool of such an energy, because it wasn't one of the Western Roman regions that actually that remained more preserved from the Roman past, and this is actually something which is true roughly for the whole western half of the Western Empire, especially during the 5th century at a point. Then usually there are certain moments of let's say of crack. I don't know how you want to say that. It sounds bad, but that they are considered a bit of a watershed for all these areas. If you take, I don't know, for North Africa, well, usually the Roman Africa is usually ending conceptually with the Arab invasions, so pretty late in time. There is this tendency today to stress that actually the Roman, and I agree with this, that the Roman society, the late antique society, generally speaking, doesn't matter whether it was still ruled by the Romans or whether it had already passed under peoples, but kind of ended much later than the 5th century, much later than the fall of the West. the western half. And this is indeed true. You can argue that this is true for northern Africa. If you take southern Spain, that's as well the thing, because the Arabs indeed change a lot when they invade Andalusia, etc. But even if you look at Visigothic Spain, it's partly one of the regions in which there was more continuity with late antique society. Perhaps not so much in the north, that in fact was not controlled by the Visigoths, and that's a pretty good indicator of the fact that late antique society was surviving in those areas into which the Roman base, the Roman infrastructure, the Roman structure, or whatever you want to call it, was still functioning. Now, it's pretty obvious that at the beginning of the 8th century, Visigothic Spain was not a Roman Spain anymore. But there was a continuity that doesn't correspond. It didn't see any brutal any brutal break from late antique society. And by the way, the Visigoths were trying essentially to stress that, even at an ideological point of view, because they were pretty imitative of Constantinople at the time. Britain, take Britain. Britain was indeed one of the least Romanized areas, provinces of the empire. At least it had been. Usually the lowlands were, I mean, if you take were usually the most Romanized thing. Rome was there as long as there were cities, as long as there was a certain degree of fertility that could sustain the local government and military. So certain areas like Wales or even the north of England today weren't that Romanized, but let's say that in that case the Romano-Brittonic, let's say, society had survived until the Anglo-Saxon invasions. That also definitely took much of what existed of the Roman world in there, but also it was one of the, as we were saying, one of the least Romanized areas, so it was kind of a... Excuse me, I drink a little. With Italy, you see, Italy basically survives as a Roman society until the Greek Gothic War. It is true that eventually the Byzantines reconquer Italy and make all that as sort of this new province. This kind of had its Roman influence injected partly once again, but the whole social tissue was destroyed. I mean, those very bases, especially the senatorial estates that were and cities that were essentially the two cornerstones over which late antique society worked, had been destroyed. And it might have been that a continuous Byzantine rule of Italy might have maybe make survive certain things, but it was a pretty critical situation. And in that sense, when the Longobards invaded Italy, that's the moment of break, the moment of change. Although the biggest moment, in my opinion, was exactly the Greek Gothic War, for the sheer destructiveness of destructions that took place. I mean, very often Longobards are credited with this extremely violent and destructive force, but even if it had been so, which was not true, by the way, because you don't destroy the place where you want to go live in, and that's like the ABC of logics, really. But aside from that, there was not much left anymore to destroy into Italy, so it's kind of... but let's say that in that sense the Longobards managed through their culture to represent a more appealing model also for the Italians, that in this sense were quite strongly Germanized from a cultural point of view. And yet in Italy you find this kind of very weird pattern of frontier that basically kept existing, with generally the Byzantine south and the Byzantine presence scattered chiefly along the coasts, because they were the ones that could be reached by the Byzantine navy. which definitely had no rivals at that point, at least until the Arab invasions in the Mediterranean, and then you find essentially a Longobarд hinterland, and you realize that even the Byzantine areas eventually got kind of grew pretty homogeneous to them, because eventually Italy was far, Constantinople with the Arab invasions kind of shrank territorially speaking, so even there that's a moment of break. Gaul is a bit more complicated, because Gaul is this area which, first of all, it's very large. Here we have a very beautiful map of which I'm very proud, and Gaul was very diverse in its areas. Naturally, the south of Gaul was the most Romanized. Regions like Provence or the Narbonensis Gaul or Aquitaine were pretty strongly Romanized, and they had they were lands of very ancient Romanization. The Romans started going there essentially from at least conquering from the 2nd century BC. They were already there before, but let's say that those were areas that even they had a history of urbanization even before the Roman invasion with the Greek colonies of the southern French Mediterranean. The rest of Gaul was pretty homogeneously Celtic. The northeast, the so-called Gallia Belgica, that is where the Belgians dwelt, was different, was wilder on average, but it wasn't this extremely different from the rest of Gaul. And then you had Armorica. It was this kind of very isolated area, but it's also pretty small. That corresponds to today's Bretagne. And even in Gaul, just like we've seen in Britain, for instance, there were areas that were pretty strongly Romanized, and others that remained basically untouched. If you take the so-called Bagaudae or Bagaude and the revolts that occurred into later Roman times, you realize that really the nature of what Gaul, first of all, let's stick to the origins. Gaul was before the Roman invasion, so there were only the Celts before. And these other populations, like from northern Iberia, like the Vascones, the Aquitanians, and all, was first of all a very, very wealthy land. As we all know, the French soil has always been this a hugely fertile area in terms of sheer quantity of agricultural resources. France has always been at the top, and that's the reason why. Historically, it eventually grew to preeminence with the Kingdom of France, and think about the hegemonic role that it had since the in the Renaissance era, before the Wars of Italy, and then at the time of the Sun King after the Wars of Religion. And that's because of the sheer amount of agricultural resources. It's a very fertile soil, lots of very big rivers, kind of overall temperate climate, mitigated by the Atlantic currents, and so this very happy, lucky combination of environmental factors that had always made Gaul since the Bronze Age an extremely fertile land. So this had triggered, even before the Roman conquest, the rise of certain what the Romans called in Latin oppida, and that is the term that is still used in fact in archaeology to define these Celtic settlements that had begun to spread as agricultural centers. So these were born like all settlements in history, practically as warehouses, as warehouses, as stocks, food stocks, and eventually got fortified and gave rise to this what we call a sort of proto-urbanization. So when they hadn't reached urbanization proper, that was a prerogative of the east of the Mediterranean, the wealthiest areas like like Greece and Italy, etc. So these tribes, the Celtic tribes, didn't have cities proper, but they had already these centers. By the way, they were already connected by a road system. And when the Romans invaded Gaul, they basically founded their own Roman cities exactly over the ones that already existed. They built up their Roman roads over the Celtic ones that already existed. So sometimes there was a bit of relativism regarding the fact that the Celts were already dead. They already had cities and roads before the Romans. No, they didn't. But let's say that compared to other peoples, they were pretty much advanced, and simply because they had more resources. But their tribal systems weren't like they were similar to peoples like the Dacians in some measure. I mean, the Dacians were a kingdom proper, and so it's a bit of a different thing. It was never a Gallic kingdom. There were at best certain confederations at the very end of Gallic history, like the one of Vercingetorix, to kind of fight together against the Romans, but was nothing unitary. And telling the truth, there was this idea in the ancient world that if all that the Romans stated, by the way, that if the Gauls had all united, that they would have been unstoppable. There is also this critique towards the Germans that you find even in the Bello Gallico, that the Gauls had grown wealthier and therefore lazier compared to the Germans, so they had lost their military prowess. But telling the truth, the Gauls were a pretty advanced population for European standards at the time. Anyhow, the Romans conquered Gaul, as we all know. It took 8 years, but it was meant to stay, and it was very intensely Romanized. So this system of cities and roads remained the cornerstone of the Roman government into the region. By the way, France has always been a very easy land to control, strategically speaking, because there are, at least in its most productive areas, there are no major natural obstacles. It's this very open ground with, there are many rivers that maybe can be difficult to pass, but telling the truth, I mean, from a military point of view, it's very easy to control everything. You have these roads, this very it's kind of a rational it's pretty rationally divided with all these centers of Celtic and Roman origin that eventually grew to be the French cities that exist today. They're pretty easy to control. So it's not like Italy or Spain that have been the nightmare of every army and that have ever been fighting in there, because they are a hell of a territory that they're devastating. France, it might be difficult to conquer. You gave me that, but it's very easy once you have it to control it well. So at this time of the 5th century, Gaul had arrived into this frame of this world that sometimes it's difficult to think about it, but even when the Western Roman Empire fell, these regions of the West still believed to be part of the empire. Now, we have attached an ideological thing to the idea that, the Western fell, the Germans arrived. But telling the truth, the biggest thing around was still the Roman Empire. Doesn't matter whether the capital was Constantinople at that time. It doesn't matter even before the fall of the West that the Western Empire was growing weaker, but the idea was that the empire was still there. And that all these lands, first of all, belonged by right of conquest to the empire, historically speaking, so that you see, for instance, that in the 6th century Justinian reconquest was aimed exactly at that, at regaining what by right was belonged to the Romans, obviously from their perspective. But even the new Germanic conquerors still conceived themselves profitably as part of this system. Obviously, they were playing in it very cunningly, in the sense that they didn't want to be Roman subjects, but they understood that the Roman Empire first of all was still there, especially before the Arab invasions. Nobody could let's say even think that the Roman Empire couldn't get back into the affairs of those lands. But secondly, there was a sanction that came from Constantinople sometimes of the control, let's say, of the legitimacy of the Germanic rule over these areas on behalf of Rome. For instance, the Clovis that founded the Merovingian Empire, so the largest power of the Romano-Germanic world, he was given, if I'm not wrong, the vicariate of the Gauls, because, by the way, Gaul was not one. They were conceived normally as various Gauls, historically 3, but then eventually from Diocletian onwards the provinces had been augmented, and so there were less. In fact, what you see there were more. In fact, what you see in here is you see all these various areas, the Aquitania first, Aquitania second, Aquitania third, Narbonensis first, Narbonensis second. I mean, it was there were many provinces, but overall, and Clovis had been the vicariate for these areas. So it was implicit, like a bit like Theodoric with the Ostrogoths in Italy. I mean, the Ostrogoths had been sent into Italy by Constantinople, so they were de facto ruling in there. This partly because these peoples were federati, but also because it was a way for Constantinople to get rid of them from the Balkans. But there was this idea that the Roman Empire had been this greatest thing that even the Germans were rightfully fearful of, because yesterday I made a video about the religious meaning of the Roman eagle and the symbol of the empire that has to be understood also in terms of international relations, as this fear indeed towards an empire that maybe at this time of the late antique wasn't that powerful, definitely like it had been in the past, and in relative terms up to a certain point, because even the enemies partly had grown weaker because of this general crisis of Eurasia at the time. But it had been chosen. It was, for instance, at this point a Christian empire, and therefore the empire of God. The Roman Empire wasn't a Christian empire. The Roman Empire was the Christian empire, and even these Germanic populations that were largely still pagan, but at least their elites had converted to Arianism most of the times. The Gauls, the Franks, incidentally had converted directly to Catholicism, because they had the Merovingians had quite cleverly understood that equated to a sort of very privileged relation with Rome, with Constantinople, with Rome, I mean the Pope, obviously, and then with Constantinople, and also with the Gallic episcopate. So this was say Clovis conversion straight from paganism straight to Catholicism without passing through Arianism was is probably one of the best indicator of how important Roman culture and the Catholic identity in this sense was in Gaul. In fact, by the way, Gaul had been one of the Roman provinces of earliest Christianization, especially in the south. And in fact, especially in southern Gaul, there was a big deal of monasteries. You know that essentially towards in late antique times, there are lots of Cenobitic models that are exported in the West. You find them everywhere. You find them in Italy, in Spain. There was this idea, especially that with the decline of cities, let's say, a sort of coming back to the countryside, that there was this push, also in the general picture, like It was definitely conceived as the moment of decline of the empire, of wars, of epidemics and all that. These monastic experiences were pushed. And it was the idea of abandoning the city, going to live somewhere wild, in the woods, in the mountains, and living in say in stricter connection with God and nature and all. And Gaul here pioneered the really these Cenobitic practices in the West. Think about and think of all these saints in Gallic history that eventually remained so important, like Saint Martin of Tours. Here find it, Turonum was called on the Loire River. But the words that obviously influenced the whole Gallic Cenobitism, because by the way, at this time the splitting of the empire had brought to a sort of provincialism in terms of, let's say, the Gallic episcopate considered itself as Gallic, in fact. The Italian when considered itself Italic, and etc. So there were even certain local traditions were conceived to be sort of part of this broader community, and especially here in the south of Gaul, here you see at the border with Italy, in what is today's Provence, in the Maritime Alps. Here you find, I don't know if you can see that when I export it graphically, there are some small islands in here in front of the French coast, and these are called the Rhine. They're in front of Cap d'Antibes. That's where basically Napoleon landed in after he was kept prisoner in the Elbe island in Tuscany. And I was here in vacations. By the way, it's a beautiful place. If you ever go to vacations in Côte d'Azur in France, I've been there lots of times. And it's really fantastic. And the Leuran Islands are beautiful. You can take the boats and go in there, visiting them. It's beautiful. There are also certain German bunkers, because here during World War II, I mean, a lot of history in there. And those Leuran had the most important Cenobitic community, monastic community of the whole Western Europe at the time. And what is interesting about these communities is that they weren't, Cenobitism in certain areas of Europe at this time was essentially a poor Cenobitism. The idea was based on the Spartan conception that, I don't know, the monks had to leave essentially with nothing, a very few, like only the essential for surviving and all. And the Leuran were similar in this fashion, but one character of the Gallic Cenobitism is that the people who went there weren't in this isolation from the world, weren't really meant to stay there forever, but they were very often sons of these very wealthy Gallo-Roman families that existed still in Gaul, because we have said the late antique society was still functioning in there, that went there into these monasteries to make a sort of an apprenticeship, and then coming and therefore acquiring this aura of holiness that obviously the community saw at the time is very important, but then coming back to be bishop of one of these big southern Gallic Roman cities that were very important, very rich. By the way, the church very often, so when the Roman authority evaporated, was the true ruler of the area, also in terms of land property, etc. Very often there was this passage of public land to ecclesiastical land. So if you imagine even the wealth of this, and especially here in the Rhone basin in the south, between in Provence here and the Narbonenses, let's say, were extremely wealthy in this point. And this was a bit like the corner you see here between the Massif Central and the Alps. This is kind of an enclave. It was in strict contact with Italy as well, and you can imagine all the implications here. But such very important dioceses were present scattered all over Gaul, and when the Franks invaded the north of Gaul, that was one of the north of Gaul was a bit different from the south, in the sense that it had gone more depopulated. It was one of those reasons, those regions into which the break with Roman rule was more. It wasn't really that direct, but it was more. It went faster, especially with the Frankish invasion. Even we know that there was a relatively low demographic density, so even from a cultural point of view, the north of France was much more affected by the Franks, even ethnically speaking. In terms of demographic impact, the Franks weren't really that many like all the Germanic peoples at the time in terms of sheer numbers, but such regions were so depopulated at some time that they were literally refilled with this Germanic ethnicity, and that's why northern France is historically so different from the south, partly also from this reason. They spoke different languages. Think about the langue d'Oil in the north and the Languedoc in the south. Then in the east you find here that these were still part of the here you see basically a Roman Gaul ended up with the Rhine famously. So you find these regions where these provinces, Roman provinces, were called Germania or Germania, first and second. But telling the truth, they had been called this way by the Romans, but even this part was anciently populated by. It was anciently believed, at least from a geographical point of view, to be Gallia Belgica. And it is true, however, that the Belgians, historically speaking, they're normally intended as Celts, but telling the truth, they were pretty mixed with the Germans, and some of them even preferred to be considered Germans than Celt. By the way, they were an hybrid essentially, but still this area was part of Roman Gaul. And some of the most important cities like Colonia Agrippina, and here you can see Bonna, these are all Mogontiacum here, these are very important German cities today. That is Cologne, Bonn, Mainz. Here you find Argentorate, for instance, that is Strasbourg in Alsace. Today it's in France, but historically speaking it was also pretty intensely Germanized area. The Alemanni were settled here at this point. So this map is, by the way, as you can read from 400 AD, but I'm just talking, say, about the 5th and 6th century, to which this thing basically. I mean, at the beginning of the 5th century, there is this big crossing of all the Germanic populations into Gaul. Most of them would leave, as a matter of fact, but the Franks and the Alemanni and the Burgundians were to stay. So even here, this border is kind of meaningless in de facto. So going back to the importance of Gaul, why was Gaul so important at this point? Well, I'd say that since Rome and late Rome, since the 3rd century, the crisis of the 3rd century, Italy had been up to the 3rd century, let's say, the center of the empire. Both from a demographical, an economical, a strategical point of view, Italy had remained the center. With the crisis of the 3rd century, and obviously during the 1st and 2nd century, other provinces had began, especially through the extension of the citizenship, Roman citizenship, to rise, because they were important, including Gaul. Gaul was, from the 1st century AD, a big deal of the Roman legionaries was actually recruited from this Gallic world. I think 1/3 of the Roman legionaries in the 1st century AD were Gallic, which, by the way, includes also the Gauls of northern Italy, of Cisalpine Gaul, but an increasing amount of those were recruited also from Gaul proper. And this is a witness to the very intense degree of Romanization and co-optation of the Celtic elites into the Roman politics and administration. Caesar had pushed a lot. The Volta Bello Gallico is a piece of political propaganda to integrate the Gauls into the Roman Empire, for extending the citizenship. Many of Caesar legions were recruited among Celtic populations of northern Italy that maybe at that point were definitely Romanized, because in order to be a legionary you had to be a Roman citizen, but those were areas that had been given the Roman citizenship very recently. So we can say that even part of Italy in this sense, and of the core of the empire, was partly Celtic since the beginning. I mean, the Celts had invaded Italy from the 5th to the 3rd century BC essentially, and they had arrived up to central Italy to settle, and they even pillaged Rome famously. So this, I think that is often misunderstood, is that the Romans were different. I mean that the Italic populations were different from the Celtic ones. Actually, it's really false. This is a prejudice that stemmed from the same Romans who wanted to stress the difference between themselves and the enemies, let's say, so by saying, oh, we were shorter, we were darker, which was true on average, but we destroyed these guys that couldn't even march a half of our speed as an army, or building fortresses and all. But the reality, actually, also you can see from material culture, from genetics, from linguistics. Actually, Latin is pretty close to Celtic as an Indo-European language, where certain words are practically the same. Even the declension of the Celtic class is pretty similar to the second Roman class. I mean, it's pretty. There was a lot of continuity in this sense. The myth of the Romans as this Mediterranean population opposed to the northern one in this kind of atavic sense, it's nothing but a 19th century racist stereotype. At the time especially, these populations were pretty similar also in their tribal nature. I mean, Rome was a city, but even if you went out of Rome, the rest of the Italic populations were also tribal peoples essentially, and they had lots in common with. But aside from this, I was saying that Italy from the 3rd century AD begins to lose importance. First of all, the Italians didn't went to. I say the Italians not for in a national sense. I say the Italians because in Italy there were different populations, so I mean Italian from a geographical point of view. So the populations of Italy were, say better in this way, were progressively, they didn't go into the army anymore because they had gentrified. They didn't want to go to war anymore. In fact, this is a bit the leitmotif of the Roman expansionism, that basically as long as the local populations Romanized, they lost their tribal warlike edus and began to lose some importance. In fact, as a matter of fact, also Gaul at this point wasn't producing this huge amount of troops anymore. The 3rd century usually was the century of the Illyrians, and not surprisingly, because Illyria was one of the most savage regions of the empire, had not still civilized, and therefore had a lot of people who still wanted to go to war as a profitable career for bettering their, and that hence where you have all the Illyrian emperors in the 3rd century that really saved the empire. Because the Roman Empire might have easily fallen into the 3rd century, and instead, thanks to such figures, think about Aurelianus, just to sell, he was called Restitut Orbis, that means the restorer of the world. So just imagine how they were felt. Obviously, a bit of a propaganda touch, but really Aurelianus is one of the greatest Roman emperors ever. But aside from this, I was saying that Italy began to lose practically also, and Rome, its strategical importance. There were other capitals in the empire that were growing of importance essentially from a strategical point of view. That is a strictly military one, closer to the frontiers, and more important. In the east, the major centers were definitely Nicomedia, on the Bithynian, in Asia Minor, essentially, and that's important because it's a sort of precursor to Constantinople. Constantinople was Byzantium that was refounded by Constantine. Byzantium was a Greek colony, and then it was refounded by Constantine in there. But the strategical important meaning attached was controlling the straits of the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. So that's why Nicomedia and then or Nicomedia said better, and Constantinople were there. Then another very crucial center was Naissus on the Danube, and this was it's today's Serbian city of Niš, I believe it's called Nis. It's written Nis with a I don't know how to say that. I'm pretty ignorant. Sorry, Serbians. I didn't want to say anything wrong. And it was a very important because Naissus controlled essentially the middle Danube. The Danubian area was pretty turbulent at the time, so it was a very important center, and it would remain historically speaking. In the west, the most important cities were Milan, Mediolanum, so you see here Milan was important at the time because it was a big deal of shifting of the Roman armies between from let's say the western and eastern axis of Europe. So necessarily you had to pass through Mediolanum in order to say going from Gaul to the Balkans. Think about Constantine that basically started his enterprise from Britain, had to go up to the east. So Milan was this, as well as Naissus and Nicomedia, was this very important passage of. And then mostly and especially the most important strategical city in Western Roman Empire at this point was Augusta Treverorum, that is today's Trier in Germany. So you can see it here. It was the major center of Gaul, and this was actually we'll see that the prefecture of Gauls, which after the splitting of Diocletian, especially the quadripartitions of the empire, basically controlled everything from Scotland to Morocco. The whole military administration of this fourth of the empire was from Trier. Trier is another beautiful city. I had luck to go on vacation, and it's amazing. There is the Porta Nigra, the Roman gate, that today is all black because it's been ruined by time. It was all white, and it was Trier was a massive city, fortified, very important. This fell into the Franks, I believe. At a certain point, it was also object of content here, and it always remained of great importance, historically speaking, also during the Middle Ages and onwards. So, in this sense, Gaul was acquiring a greater importance. And the Romans, by the way, there was the Rhine frontier in here. Lots of legions were deployed in Gaul, de facto, and especially were lots of estates that were created by the Romans in this eastern area that were aimed at maintaining all the legions there, because they had to eat, and in a time like this, into which the rate of growth of crop rate was essentially enough just for a virtually nothing more than survival economy. Just think what it means to maintain tens of thousands of troops in here. I mean, a huge logistical effort, which tells you how this area was strategically important for the Romans, and why such cities rose of such great importance. And overall, therefore, Gaul had been this this very important center toward which basically the strategical balance of the West shifted from Italy to Gaul. And you can argue that indeed, even in this late antique and early medieval period, Gaul was legitimately more important even than Italy in some measure. Italy then was, I mean, there are also many political reasons for this. It's not just a sheer quantity of, because Italy was pretty wealthy still, but it had a very different society. Um, First of all, you have to think that Italy, after the Greek-Gothic War, as we were saying before, was razed to the ground. So all these big latifundia that characterized the senatorial rule went destroyed. And it was very difficult, therefore, to maintain an effective Roman government after the Justinian reconquest. In fact, when Italy was invaded by the Longobards, there was practically no one there defending her, because the Byzantine mobile army was somewhere else. Well, we must say that in this, excusing the Byzantines in a certain sense, or at least trying to understand them. I'm personally happy that the Longobards came in Italy, because I think they gave so much to European history. I mean, telling the truth, which people are completely unaware today, and I don't understand how. But let's say that at that point the Justinian plague had kicked in, so it was practically impossible to control of this huge territories that the Byzantines had reconquered, with now a collapse into manpower due to demographical fall and etc. So, but one of the things that eventually came to characterize and to distinguish Italy from Gaul at this point is that Italy not having as large estates anymore, so actually a strengthening of the per capita wealth. Italy remained the wealthiest country in the world uninterruptedly from the Roman times to this late 17th century, and this was all due, in part, at least in medieval times, to the fact that the great Roman latifundia had been lost. And you say, why? Well, simply because the land at that point would have belonged only to one person. The other people would have been all serfs and colons. Instead not. During the Lombard times, and also partly into the Byzantine territories, basically the Italians came to have all their decent amount of land pro each. And this is interesting, because if you consider how it happened instead in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, you realize that, I know, great part of, I don't know, the rise of Western, say, think about the maritime republics of Italy in the Middle Ages, the humanism, the Renaissance, actually started from this. In the Byzantine Empire, everything was still kept in the hands of those few nobles, and this skilled economical competition, for instance. Individual chance of getting educated, or and this all started from this initial division of this initial collapse and disaster that Italy, and that paradoxically produced this actually positive consequence in a world that was usually ruled by these extremely powerful aristocracies that didn't give a damn about the peasants and all. In Italy, this instead wasn't that true. Gaul was all a different thing, because in Gaul, this unbreaked and constant discontinuity, let's say, with the Roman times had made the Gallic estates survive largely intact. Now, what had happened? Obviously, also Gaul had undergone devastations during the migration era, but they weren't so massive like the ones in Italy. They were actually not even caused by the Germanic invasions, rather by the Byzantine reconquest. That is a wholly other thing. Actually, the Ostrogoths were defending Italy, even if with their scorched heart policy, basically they destroyed it. But and therefore a peculiar characteristics of Gaul that I've been talking extensively about this in the Frankish Merovingian Kingdom video. So if you're interested, you can go there, listen to it. Is that these very large senatorial estates passed intact from the late antique times to the early Middle Ages. So one of the major consequences of this is that Gaul, first of all, Gaul was extremely rich, as we have said. I think quantitatively was even wealthier than Italy in terms of sheer amount of resources. But these resources were concentrated in the hands of a very few people that were namely the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, usually bishops, also lay owners, but chiefly the church was that important in Gaul, and that was also so instrumental in building up the French monarchy eventually, together with the Merovingian one, telling the truth. And in fact, the Franks, the Germanic aristocracy. And this Gallo-Roman Germanic world basically got blended together. And if you see the Carolingian world, it's essentially this perfect synthesis of Gauls, Romans, Gallo-Romans, say better, and Germans. And this meant that this aristocracy had a huge power individually. This means that the average Gallic inhabitant was poorer than the average Italian inhabitant. But the Gallic aristocracies were way wealthier and more powerful than the Italian aristocracies, whether they were Lombard or Byzantine. We should say in this sense the Longobards were a bit more egalitarian. Eventually they came up to conquer almost all of Italy, so even usually in the Byzantine world of Italy, in the Byzantine areas of Italy, maybe the also in there the estates had maybe maintained a little bit more, but as we said, the whole peninsula had been razed to the ground, so even in there wasn't this huge growth, this huge it was really Gaul. Now this thing of the wealth of the Gallic aristocracy is the cornerstone for the rise of not just of the Merovingians but also of the Carolingians. I've made a video which is called the I'm searching for you, the Frankish Commendatio, which is a Latin word, at the origins of the vassalitic beneficiary system. Now this video kind of explains the roots of the Carolingian vassalitic beneficiary system into the Gallo-Roman society that was adopted by the Franks when they got in Gaul, and they got unavoidably Romanized also in this sense. But what is important in here is to understand that the whole history of Gaul and the rise of Charlemagne, of the Carolingians, and the creation of the empire and the creation of feudalism starts from this Gallic land distribution. Because Gaul, even before the Carolingians, was used to have these very large clienteles, depending from these, as we've seen, very wealthy masters, domini, as we're still called in Latin, that could therefore have military retinues. So this idea that there is a relation, that is the ABC of the Carolingian world, and therefore of Frankish Europe, of feudal Europe, is that you need land in order to perform a military service. So in this sense the Carolingians didn't invent anything, they just reorganized basically when they reconquered the whole the ancient Frankish empire that had went basically by the 7th century. The Merovingians, a Frankish kingdom didn't exist anymore. Essentially they were 4 split kingdoms. Even the Longobards were more powerful individually than these parts. Excuse me. The Carolingians basically reconquered everything, and in order to do so they basically restructured the whole aristocracies by entrusting these lands. Interestingly, most of these lands were confiscated to the so-called from the ecclesiastical lands. People might think that it's the evil Frankish the Carolingian counts that arrived and stole the land from the poor parish country priests. No, it didn't happen like that. I mean, ecclesiastical lands in that context in the beginning of the 8th century equated to the lands that the local bishops had usurped to the Frankish public authority. Say public is a big word for the Frankish world, but say to what belonged privately to the Merovingian dynasty, let's say better, and that basically retook that. In fact, Charles Martel suffered a very horrible of a very bad press, let's say at the time, because all these ecclesiastical aristocrats couldn't tolerate that, and they hated his guts because of it. But that's how the Carolingian world was built. How the feudal, let's say, feudal comes later, but say the vassalic beneficiary military retinues were formed. Say, you are faithful to me, I give you this land, and you come to go to make war with me. That this is in a nutshell the Carolingian Empire. And this worked as long as the empire expanded, and therefore other land could be given. Then eventually, it's a bit like the Roman Empire. It overstretched, and there was no land. They started, basically, the Carolingians started to kill themselves with each other, and the empire fell. But all this could have not been possible if it hadn't started from Gaul. And from this social structure that already saw the presence of this very powerful military clientele that were out there. Just to make a comparison, which also explains why the Carolingians conquered the Longobard kingdom, which was at the time was even rising in power, and it's that the Longobards didn't have anything like that. I mean, maybe individually were still this, the Longobards were quite proud of their Germanic origins, traditions, etc. But they had also gentrified, especially in the most Romanized areas of Italy. They kind of were more businessmen than military men, and they didn't have those large military clienteles like the Franks. Hence, they couldn't essentially afford to spend their whole life on horseback training for war like the Carolingians did. And by the way, the Carolingians were the exception in this sense. This was unknown everywhere else, but in Italy, in Britain, in Spain, there was no one who was fighting. Well, Spain now was falling to the Arabs, but let's say not even in Germany, because simply there weren't the resources for achieving anything like that. So Gaul was the only place that could support the rise of professionalism, of mounted warriors, mounted fighters on a large scale. And it's not surprising that, the feudalism, an attached chivalric culture, eventually the courtly literature, emanated all over Europe from this area of northern France that had been the core of the Frankish domains, and where the Franks had settled exactly because they had found in these times of the late antique a big deal of the Roman estates still intact, and therefore seizing them to use them for their own. Basically, if you understand this point, you have understood half of medieval history. And this is how really the whole thing began. If you wonder where feudalism started, you can argue that in a certain measure, let's say, this was happening also somewhere else. Even the Byzantines were kind of feudalizing in part, and think about the decentralization of military recruitment with the themata or the later pronoia system that was a sort of a feudal thing, with the only exception that, well, in part was a greater control in the state, simply because in the Byzantine Empire there was a state, while in the Carolingian Empire there's never been a state. The greatest cultural limit of the Franks and of the Carolingians is that they couldn't understand in any way that there had to be a public authority. the Franks conceived, is still in the old Germanic fashion, the idea that their empire was essentially private property, and they had hence it had to be split according to Germanic tradition into the various people. Well, it wasn't really a Germanic tradition because, yeah, it was Germanic, but let's say it wasn't Germanic to have built up a dynasty, which instead the Franks did. So even if you want to understand the origins of the French monarchy, you have to look at that, because the French monarchy really didn't, it can't be conceived historically speaking as a continuation of the Merovingians, but let's say that the big deal of political and cultural characters attached to the monarchy was still something that originated in this area of northern France and that eventually lived on also in the French kingdom. That became the monarchy par excellence in history. Because for instance, I said this because for instance the Longobards weren't like that. The Longobards were so Germanic in mindset that they still elected their kings, but this also was due to the dynamics of land distribution into Italy, because if Italy had maintained those large estates that existed in Gaul, then it's probable that the Longobards would have seized them and trying to form a dynasty in there as well, because they would have had the structural basis to impose a single ruler on everyone. Instead, in Italy, it wasn't not possible. The Longobard king had, in this sense, less private property in terms of land than the average Frankish nobleman at this time. Just to tell you the sheer difference, it's a massive difference. I mean, what they had in Gaul, in this sense, it wasn't known anywhere else in the West. Completely, maybe just a little bit in Spain, but it didn't seem to work that well against the Arabs, did it? The Anglo-Saxons were, in any case, the Visigothic kingdom was essentially even there a cluster of noblemen that wanted to stem the Visigothic kings. In fact, the Visigothic kings at the time of the Arab conquest had an authority that didn't go like 30 miles out of Toledo, that was the capital. The Anglo-Saxons less than ever, because they were like, Britain couldn't sustain anything like that economically speaking, and plus they were all, in fact, it's not surprising that there were all these cluster of smaller kingdoms that eventually rose. I must say the Anglo-Saxons actually are very fascinating, because they managed to eventually to build up. I mean, it took them the Viking invasions to understand that, to stick together practically, but they managed to build up a kingdom, and a hell of a kingdom, telling you the truth, by the 11th century, that however took a lot of time, because the local resources weren't that many. But Gaul instead had this all along, and if from one side it created a huge political instability, and you can see that with the Merovingian Empire collapsing, because it's split into all these smaller powers that weren't capable of. Eventually also allowed the Carolingians, with their reinforced military might. By the way, the Carolingians had this kind of more, they came from the very east, from the frontier in Germany with the Saxons, so they have very high military quality, and they managed to reconquer because of that all this. It all worked thanks to these military clienteles, but eventually they split up once again, although they set up the economical balances of Europe, say the social balance, political and social balances of Europe, by exporting the Frankish feudalism all over. So that for the 13th century, basically the whole Europe, the whole Western Europe at least, had this had feudalism that had originated in there, into Gaul. So another thing I would like to stress, though, is the importance of cities that I began the video with, but I didn't conclude that much. Because the cities, as we've said, were the centers of this, the Gallo-Roman senatorial elite. They were very advanced centers. Most of them didn't go destroyed during the migration era. So there are at least four. There are wards of the mention. Three are we already discussed about it, but let's talk about it again. So one of the first most important cities in Gaul had been Marseille. So Marseille was founded seemingly in 600 BC, so very very old days, from Hellenic colonists of Phocaea, that is in today's Turkey, because the Greeks were there. These coastal polis had been founded there, and indeed southern Gaul, as we said before, even before the Roman conquest, was actually pretty already Hellenized. There were other, even in Empúries in Spain was this other big Greek colony, so there was a lot of traffics, a lot of things. The Celts extensively traded with the Greeks, even though they weren't that Hellenized. Another thing you have to understand about the ancient world is very interesting, is that when you find a Greek colony, you don't have to think that it was essentially it was a demographic center, but it was mostly versed for trade. Let's say that if you went 30 miles inland, then it was completely a Celtic world. Like the Greek influence, aside from things that the Celts could buy, but essentially Celtic society was pretty homogeneous everywhere in Gaul. You can't say that since there were the Greeks, they had kind of grown. I don't know, they had invented the phalanxes or something like that. It's absolutely not. I will discuss that once in my military history video, because that's a great misconception. But it's still important that there was a urban tradition into Gaul coming from these Hellenic cities. Excuse me, I drink once again a little. So, and so Marseille was a very big city, by the way. By the time it was allies with Rome during the Second Punic War against Carthage, and kind of lost a bit of power after Caesar's civil war, because they basically lost independence. I mean, the Romans were kind of tolerant with the Greek city-states. They kind of embraced the concept that as Hellenistic rulers, that their rule hadn't to be imposed. It just deterrence was just enough. But at a certain point, take the sack of Corinth, or in this sense, what happened to Massalia, at a certain point they kind of terminated that, at least in certain areas, because Greece was otherwise pretty autonomous. I mean, you don't have to think of the Roman Empire as this oppressive thing in terms. I mean, it was very brutal in the way it conquered, and obviously you weren't free. But they were largely. I mean, the Romans. All they cared was to co-opt the elites, and this meant that at least the elites were pretty autonomous and they participated to Roman politics and all, but say that's where the decline of Marseille a bit came. But it was still a very, very, very important center, especially in trade. By the 5th century that we're seeing now, it was captured by the Visigoths at a point. Charles Martel came to sack it in the 8th century, but it's kind of lived on into the county of Provence. It was also a bit. Marseille was a very frontier area with the Mediterranean. A certain way was occupied, taken by Aragonese, and then even by the Ottomans. At a point, there were Turks in there. So, I mean, this. Well, it's a bit complicated now to explain, but Marseille has always been this very international center in part. And Marseille was also very important because it was a point of contact between the Gallic hinterland and the Mediterranean, thanks to the access to the Rhone river. So that goes up north into Gaul. So that was the reason why it was such an important trade center. And it had been instrumental even to Romanization in this sense, because it was a channel through which the Romans could penetrate economically into Gaul, and therefore Romanizing also partly the Gaul with Roman artifacts, with this conveniency that the trade posed for both the parts involved. Another very this Marseille, by the way, is still today is the second largest city in France, so it's kind of gives you the dimension of how these ancient cities still they were so important, and most of the, let's say, of the French cities you see today are actually come from Roman times. Like there are certain areas of Europe that weren't urbanized, or maybe because there had not been the Romans, or because the Romans couldn't sustain in their city because of environmental reasons, and you realize that the origins of these cities are later in time, like they are medieval. Even in the same Italy, this happened because of that raising thing of the Greek-Gothic War. So Gaul instead has this great continuity with its ancient Roman and Celtic centers in terms of urbanism and of political and territorial rule. And this is what I would like to leave you with at the end of this video. Then another very big important city was the one, and is still the one, of Lyon. So the famously Lyon was called Lugdunum in Latin. The larger name was this the name that was eventually because the Romans basically refounded the local Celtic centers. Sometimes they built them from scratch, but it was rare because the Romans were clever to go build, like anyone else, by the way, the new cities over centers that were already developed, so in very important strategical locations like the one of Lyon. And it was evidently, sometimes these cities today have overly expanded. If you take Paris, that was, by the way, a very minor center in Gaul at the time, and eventually grew to as Lutetia Parisiorum, or Lutetia Parisiorum, that it grew as Paris. It's, if you see the historical center, it's very small. But it overly extended. So you have to look at the core of the ancient city to understand eventually the importance of it. With Lyon, is kind of evident over the river, just like Paris and all. And the so this it's interesting also to see this. These origins, like think about the etymology, like Lugudunon, from Gaulish, then eventually Latinized in Lugdunum. It was named Fortress of the god Lugus, Fortress of Lugus. Lugus was a Celtic god, and it's found in ethnonyms and in the word the Lugoi, for instance, were a Celtic tribe of Gaul. So there are always certain pre-Roman settlements to these cities, and Lugdunum overexpanded. It was a very important center, and especially it was already a religious Celtic center that the Romans in this sense transformed into a holy sanctuary for Rome and Augustus at the time. And it was so important that every year Lugdunum hosted a general assembly of the whole Gaul. So it was considered like the center, the capital of Gaul in some measure. It gave name to the Gallia Lugdunensis, that was this broad, you can see it even here in the later empire. It was this big area of Gaul that stretched from Bretagne to the Alps. Basically, it's like a crescent between Aquitaine and Belgica, essentially. That was it. And you can understand its importance, indeed. And what else can I say about Lugdunum? There will be a lot to say, but I don't want the video to be too long. However, as I was saying, during the 3rd century, the major center of Gaul, especially essentially for strategical reasons, came to be Trier. By the way, certain other cities that had been important before kind of declined, or maybe were surpassed by others. It was pretty much the norm. And Trier was in Belgic Gaul, as we have said, and it was a center that, in virtue of its military importance, actually saw the rise of the rebellion of certain of the local legions, and bringing to what was called the Empire of the Gauls. The Gauls, not the people, but the various parts into which Gaul was split. Tetricus, for instance, at the time of Aurelian, had rebelled in there and proclaimed himself Gallic emperor. And what is interesting about these rebellions, Gallic rebellions of is that this empire wasn't conceived in a positive sense in towards Rome. Like, it's not with Palmyra in Syria that rebelled to Rome and began to invade the whole eastern provinces of Rome. The Gallic Empire was felt to be a sort of community on its own that still existed in the empire, that wasn't interested in, I don't know, invading Italy or doing so. Obviously, the single emperor, this still happened into the Roman Empire, so theoretically there were political ambitions, but this is interesting because what it tells about Gaul is that it was conceiving itself as something on its own. Also in its defensive function on the Rhine frontier. So it was an area that was, it's kind of obvious, right? If you even look at it from a geographical point of view, Gaul is there. Like, in the southeast you have the Alps, in the southwest you have the Pyrenees, in the north and west you have the Atlantic Ocean, and then there is the Rhine frontier in the east with the German. It in fact is a bit more flexible and a bit more syncretic, but let's say this whole piece of land that is today's France is kind of something on its own from a geographical point of view, and that's what develops also these political and social transformations that France has always felt itself as something on its own. If you think about the Gallican Church, even in the Middle Ages, this idea that France at a certain point felt itself to be a nation, first than others. Let's say this is also a bit complicated because, telling the truth, there were several nations into France, so that's also a bit propagandistic. But generally speaking, the fact that France, for instance, was at the end of the 15th century had basically been unified by the crown by the French crown, geographically, territorially speaking, and that was this huge power that could invade Italy and make war with all the major other powers of Europe. I mean, it's always been a big thing. This had happened also in the 13th century. It had happened at the time of the Merovingians. I mean, France always had this huge, think about Napoleonic times, French Revolution, this huge agricultural power, this big demographic power, manpower. Think about the Napoleonic Wars, and all the French, the jeunesse dorée that died all over Europe, because France really had this huge amount of demographical resources that could spare. Like, maybe just Russia could go with Russia really endlessly, etc. But I mean, no country in pre-industrial time was so rich in Europe as France, definitely, and this was the reason why this community, the sense of community kind of developed, because the more resources you have, the more you can structure with a single rule, let's say support a single rule, something bigger in terms of state, of army, and etc. So with Trier, as we were saying before, this center was recognized as the Prefecture of Gaul. So it means that Britain, the Iberian Peninsula, Gaul, and Morocco were ruled at the time by from Trier. So think about how big this was in terms of influence. And so for all the 4th century, so in Constantinian times, before say the frontiers got a bit let's say troubled, Trier remained the Praetorian prefecture. That was proposed for especially as we've said, for the army, for the legions deployed along the line between the Alps and the Atlantic Ocean, and it's just when the Germans begin to push westwards from the Danubian areas that this area basically becomes unsafe, and the Romans decide to relocate the prefecture of the Gauls from the Rhine to the south of Gaul at Arles. Arles was known as Arelate in Latin, and you see that is in the very south of France. And this happened essentially after 406, when the Alans, the Vandals and the Swabians basically broke the Rhine frontier and entered Gaul, so the mess happened. And already before that, as we've seen, there were the Franks and the Alemanni partly settled into Gaul, so were acting as Roman federati, more or less. The Alemanni were a bit less friendly to the Romans than the Franks, then instead were the major allies. But up to that point, the Roman administration there had all hold on. At that point, the whole thing collapses, so the Romans decide to shift the capital of Gaul, let's say, into the south. And you see that Arelate here is in that place that we're seeing before. You have the Massif Central in the Alps that kind of come together in there. Just the Rhone passes through that, and therefore it's an important. It's easier. It was an easier position to defend in this bottleneck in here. And Arelate was already one important city at the time. It's a beautiful place. I've been fortunately and luckily in vacations there too. So southern France is really beautiful, and I would like to come back there once. It has a lot of Roman things. Think about the Roman theater of Orange, Arausio in Latin. Arelate also has a beautiful arena. Nîmes, Nemausus, these are all names you find there, and they're really beautiful places to see. It's a very beautiful synchrosis between Rome, the Middle Ages, very fascinating. Also in the west, the Toulouse or Carcassonne are beautiful centers, but that is another story. I will tell you about my trips in another occasion. I don't think you're interested, by the way. And what else to say about Arelate? Well, not excessively much. This was also a multi-ethnic area. Actually, there would be a lot to say about Arelate, but now I don't want to say. What's important is that Arelate was this area of southern Gaul was a bit not really Celtic. There were the Ligurians before. The Ligurians, there were these populations that stretched, in fact, across the Western Alps. The Ligurians lived both in Italy and northern Italy, in the same region of Liguria that exists today, and into the south of Gaul. And then the Celts kind of came later, because also the Celts actually expanded from Central Europe, and therefore they have those hadn't always been Celtic regions, and this was actually seemingly a Carthaginian port at a point, or at least a Phoenician one. And the Romans took it in 123 BC, and then expanded it, and the Romans obviously rebuilt everything as this big uniform Roman cities, and you can see how much there is there. And Marseille was actually quite influential on Arles, and in fact, in order to not to get choked by it, eventually sided with Julius Caesar against Pompey during the siege of Massalia, in fact, of Marseille. And in fact, a certain Massalian possessions that Caesar took were given to Arelate as a reward. This was interesting, and Arelate became a colony for the veterans of the Roman Legion Legio Sexta Ferrata, so the sixth Iron Legion, we can say. And it was refounded as Colonia Julia Paterna Arelatensium Sextanorum, that is the ancestral Julian colony of Arles, of the soldiers of the sixth, that is the sixth legion. So it's a very important history in some way. It was very important. It was one of the favorite cities of Constantine. Interestingly, even Constantine II was born in there. Also, Arelate was also another center of usurpations, because even it was very important strategically speaking, and it was also in here. It was a very important cultural and religious center during the Roman Empire, and it was one of the one of the earliest Christianized cities, centers of spread of Christianism at the time. The Frankish bishop of Arles, Saint Cesarius, was in here. There's actually even the Ostrogoths tried to invade this, to take it when they invaded Provence. So it's very interesting. What I wanted maybe to say about Trier, that of which I am in love, with which I am in love, let's say, poor English grammar, is that was a very multi-ethnic area. It was one of those areas that basically was the proud of Roman integration system, like other areas like Cologne. There was Alaubiorum, because those were areas that were across Germany and Gaul, and the inhabitants before the Roman conquest, they really didn't. They were a bit of a mix. Actually, the Treveri, after which Augusta Treverorum, hence Trier, took his name, were this population that lived across the Moselle, these areas of around there. That, in fact, Treveri seemingly meant, from the original language, that those who live across the rivers. That tells you this idea that they go back and forth across the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Moselle, and they were pretty mixed. They were Celto-Germanic in practice, and these were populations that were, when were conquered by the Romans, were actually pretty proud of becoming Roman citizens, and to stress the fact that they were, in fact, they had this kind of double, if not triple identity. So Roman citizens, but proud of their own local Celto-Germanic origins, and that, in fact, had all. You have to think also about all the privileges that existed of having your own oppidum, made a Roman civitas, that is a Roman city, all the economical advantages and all. I mean, probably the local communities weren't that happy of the Romans coming there to rule on them, but their elites were, and this is how the Roman integration actually worked. And Gaul is in general this very happy result of Romanization. It's one of the brightest examples of how the Romans basically made it to Romanize one place really at the core. Because with certain other areas, they take Asia Minor or Greece that were quite strongly Hellenized centers. Well, those basically remained Hellenic in mind. I mean, there was already a civilization in there that had similar levels of doubt, that actually had contributed to structure the same Roman civilization. With Gaul, aside from this Greek coastal area of the south, was definitely all Celtic, or almost all Celtic. The Romans went there and they Romanized it, and it remained Roman practically till the very end, till without any major problem given to Romanization. Although certain areas, as we said, the wildest ones hadn't been Romanized, but at least they hadn't rebelled up to the Bagaude, for instance, that emerged simply because the Romans were withdrawing from Gaul, just like from Britain, and that means that up to now that Roman rule had been so effective, because if there hadn't been revolts, I think the only revolts in Roman Gaul were like once in the first century, and the Romans simply annihilated it. And from there onward, the Romans solved problems very pragmatically, let me tell you, quite effectively and quite mercilessly, but yeah, that was what the Romans were actually in part. Military deterrence, but at the service of... I mean, the Romans cared about trade essentially going on. So they didn't want brigands, pirates thing, because those were blocking commerce and not making people pay taxes to Rome. So that's it. But here, in fact, I still want to express how Gaul still managed to carve, let's say, its own identity into the Roman Empire, its own pride, and arriving to be actually the most important center of the West, even more than Italy by the late late antique period. And this is interesting, really. And I must say there was also a very strong connection with Italy, really, a lot actually, especially from a cultural point of view, in terms of especially during the Christian times, there were a lot of Italian and Gallic. Italic and Gallic exchange and in influences, and the story of two countries definitely have a lot in common, thanks to also to the Romans. Then it's interesting that in turn Italy got Caroline, I don't know how to say, Frankicized in part, then in Carolingian times in return. Some way, and the relations between the popes and the Franks that have always been there, very strong, even before the Carolingians. This Catholicism that united the episcopates of Gaul and Italy historically. These are all very important things. Also, together with Britain, think about the so-called Via Francigena in Latin of the medieval world, this pilgrimage route that started. I mean, it was called Francigena from the Italian perspective because it came from France, and it was the road of pilgrimage from Rome that even since the very early Middle Ages, actually from the very 6th century, if not before, started even from Britain, where lots of Anglo-Saxon nobles, even kings, that wrote their testament and went in pilgrimage to Rome to die eventually, because that was the reality of existence, and they passed through Gaul, and Gaul in this sense got enriched. Think about how Gallic how important it was the Roman and Anglo-Saxon, let's say better, Roman and British axis in terms of monastic development. First of the think about the Irish and Anglo-Saxon monasticism that eventually, very peculiar on its own and guided by Rome, eventually let's say Christianized very large parts of Gaul and also of Central Europe during the Carolingian conquest. I mean, these countries really have lots in common, both for their original Roman, in fact, that were all under the Roman Empire, but also for these other relations that were formed during the late antique and early medieval times, chiefly thanks to the Church of Rome, and that made these areas so much in contact one with another. It's very fascinating. I like this map because it kind of shows, it's about Gaul, but it shows really all these areas that surround it that definitely were already interacting thanks to this joint represented by Gaul herself. So this video has been an hymn to Gaul, and it's okay, and I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested about my upcoming contents. And for now, as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.